The scream tore through the Wyoming blizzard like a knife through silence, and Jacob Hayes dropped the armful of firewood he had been carrying toward the lined shack when he heard it pierce the howling wind. He had been riding fence for the Double R Ranch when the storm hit early that December morning in 1884, forcing him to take shelter in the old cabin that sat at the edge of the property. The scream came again, weaker this time, and Jacob spun around to see a figure stumbling through the knee-deep snow about 50 yards from where he stood. The person collapsed just as he started running, his boots crunching through the frozen crust, his breath coming out in white clouds that the wind immediately scattered. When he reached the fallen figure, Jacob realized it was a woman, her dark hair plastered to her face with melting snow, her lips blue with cold. She wore only a thin dress beneath a wool coat that had seen better days, and her hands clutched her swollen belly protectively even as consciousness slipped away from her. Jacob did not hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, shocked at how light she felt despite her condition, and carried her as quickly as he could through the storm toward the lined shack. The wind fought him every step, trying to push him backward, trying to steal the precious warmth from both their bodies. By the time he kicked open the door and stumbled inside with his burden, his arms were shaking, and his face felt like someone had scraped it raw with sandpaper. He laid her on the narrow cot near the stone fireplace and immediately set to work building up the fire he had started earlier. The wood caught quickly, flames licking up and spreading warmth into the small space. Jacob worked fast, pulling off her snow-soaked coat and boots, covering her with every blanket he could find in the cabin. There were only 3, threadbare and smelling of dust and mice, but they would have to do. He rubbed her cold hands between his own, trying to bring feeling back into her fingers, and that was when her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of honey, he noticed, golden brown and filled with fear and pain. She tried to sit up, panic flooding her face, and Jacob gently pressed her shoulder back down. "You are safe," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady despite the racing of his own heart. "You are inside. The storm cannot reach you here." "My baby," she gasped, and her hands went to her belly again. "Something is wrong. The pain started this morning. I was trying to get to town to the doctor, but the storm came so fast and the wagon wheel broke and the horse ran off and—" She broke off with a cry, her body tensing, her face contorting with agony. Jacob felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. He was a cowboy, not a doctor or a midwife. He knew how to rope a steer, break a horse, mend a fence, and shoot straight. He did not know anything about delivering babies. But as he looked at this woman's frightened face and felt the cabin shake with the force of the blizzard outside, he understood with terrible clarity that he was all she had. There would be no doctor, no experienced woman to help. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even if he could somehow make it to town, which was a good 10 miles away, the woman and her baby would almost certainly die before he returned. "What is your name?" he asked, needing to anchor himself with something solid and real. "Sarah," she managed between gritted teeth. "Sarah Mitchell. My husband died 6 months ago, logging accident up in the mountains. I have been living in a soddy about 5 miles west of here, trying to make it work, but—" Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she grabbed Jacob's hand with surprising strength. Her fingernails dug into his palm. "I am Jacob Hayes," he said when she could breathe again. "I work for the Double R. I am going to help you, Sarah. We are going to get through this together." He had no idea if that was true, but he said it anyway because she needed to hear it, and because saying it out loud made him believe it might be possible. He built up the fire higher, stacking logs until the flames roared and heat began to fill every corner of the small cabin. The wind screamed outside like a living thing trying to claw its way in, but inside the fire crackled and popped and held the deadly cold at bay. Jacob found a pot and went to the door, scooping it full of clean snow to melt for water. He set it near the fire and rummaged through the cabin's meager supplies until he found a few clean rags, a sharp knife, and a bottle of whiskey someone had stashed in a corner. Sarah's contractions were coming closer together now, each one making her cry out despite her obvious attempts to stay quiet. Jacob knelt beside the cot and took her hand again. "I am not going to lie to you," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I have never done this before. But I helped birth calves and foals more times than I can count, and I know the basics are the same. You are strong, Sarah. I can see that. And your baby is strong too, or you would not have made it as far as you did through that storm." "It is too early," she whispered, tears sliding down her temples into her hair. "The baby is not supposed to come for another month. What if something is wrong? What if—" "We are not going to think about what if," Jacob interrupted firmly. "We are going to think about what is. And what is that your baby has decided today is the day to meet its mother, and we are going to make sure that happens safely." He squeezed her hand. "I need you to trust me, Sarah. Can you do that?" She searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her because she nodded. "I trust you, Jacob Hayes." The hours that followed were the longest of Jacob's life. He had faced down rustlers and outlaws, had broken horses that everyone said could not be broken, had survived a winter trapped in the mountains with nothing but his rifle and his wits, but nothing had prepared him for this. Sarah's pain was terrible to witness, and his helplessness in the face of it gnawed at him like a hungry animal. All he could do was keep the fire burning, keep the water hot, wipe her face with cool cloths and hold her hand when the contractions came. He talked to her constantly, telling her stories about his childhood in Missouri, about the time he had ridden in a cattle drive from Texas to Montana, about the ornery mare he had just finished training who had a habit of stealing hats off people's heads. Anything to keep her focused on something other than the pain. Night fell early, the way it did in winter, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it seemed to grow worse, the wind howling like wolves, snow piling up against the cabin walls. But inside, the fire burned bright and steady. Jacob fed it constantly, never letting the flames die down, keeping the temperature warm enough that Sarah stopped shivering. He stripped down to his shirt sleeves, sweat dampening his back from the heat and exertion and fear. Somewhere around midnight, Sarah let out a different kind of cry, more urgent, more desperate. "The baby is coming," she gasped. "I can feel it. Jacob, the baby is coming now." Jacob moved to the foot of the cot, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He could see she was right. "All right," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice that he did not feel. "When the next contraction comes, I need you to push. Push as hard as you can." Sarah nodded, her face pale and drawn but determined. When the contraction seized her, she bore down with a strength that amazed him, a guttural sound tearing from her throat. Jacob talked her through it, encouraged her, told her she was doing perfectly even though he had no idea if that was true. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Sarah pushed again and again, her body trembling with exhaustion, and Jacob prayed to a God he had not spoken to in years. Then, just when he feared Sarah had nothing left to give, he saw the baby's head. "I see the baby," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sarah, I see your baby. One more push, just one more." Sarah gathered every last scrap of strength she possessed and pushed. The baby slid into Jacob's waiting hands, tiny and slippery and terrifyingly still. For one horrible moment, Jacob thought they had lost, thought all of this had been for nothing. Then he remembered what the ranch foreman had once told him about a calf born not breathing, and he quickly cleared the baby's mouth and nose with his finger and rubbed the small chest briskly with a rag. The baby gasped, then it let out a thin, wavering cry that was the most beautiful sound Jacob had ever heard. Relief crashed over him like a wave, so intense it left him dizzy. "You have a son," he said, his voice thick. "Sarah, you have a son, and he is breathing and crying and alive." He used the knife to cut the cord, his hands shaking now that the crisis had passed, and wrapped the baby in the cleanest rag he could find. The child was small, too small, but his eyes were open and his tiny fists were waving and his cries grew stronger with each breath. Jacob placed him carefully on Sarah's chest, and the look on her face in that moment was something he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Joy and exhaustion and love so fierce it seemed to light her up from the inside. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she touched her son's dark hair. "Hello, my beautiful boy, you gave us quite a scare, but you are here now, you are here and you are safe." Jacob finished what needed to be done, cleaning up as best he could, making Sarah as comfortable as possible. The baby nursed, latching on with determination that seemed miraculous given his early arrival and the circumstances of his birth. Jacob stepped outside briefly to bring in more firewood, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. The storm still raged, snow falling so thick he could not see more than a few feet in any direction. They would be trapped here for hours yet, maybe longer. But inside, the fire burned bright and warm, and a new life had just begun against all odds. When he came back in with his arms full of wood, Sarah was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "You saved our lives," she said simply. "My son and I would both be dead if you had not found us. I do not know how to thank you for that." Jacob stacked the wood near the fireplace and added a few logs to keep the fire going strong. "You do not need to thank me," he said, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Not anyone would have stayed calm, not anyone would have known what to do, and not anyone would have kept that fire burning all night the way you have." She looked down at her son, who had fallen asleep against her chest, his tiny face peaceful. "I am going to tell him about this night when he is older, about the blizzard and the cowboy who saved us both." Something warm unfurled in Jacob's chest at her words, something he had not felt in a very long time. He had been alone for years, drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He had told himself he liked it that way, that he did not need connections or complications. But sitting in that small cabin with the fire crackling and Sarah holding her newborn son and the storm raging outside, he felt something shift inside him. He felt like he had found something he had not even known he was looking for. The rest of the night passed in a strange kind of peace. Jacob kept the fire burning, feeding it log after log, never letting the flames die down. He dozed a little in the chair near the fireplace, waking every time he heard Sarah or the baby stir. The infant was small but seemed healthy, his cries lusty when he was hungry, his sleep deep when his belly was full. Sarah rested as much as she could, though Jacob knew she must be in considerable pain and exhausted beyond measure. But every time he checked on her, she smiled at him, and that smile made something in his chest tighten. Dawn came slowly, the darkness outside gradually fading to gray. The wind had finally died down to a whisper, and the snow had stopped falling. Jacob went to the window and looked out at a world transformed into white silence. Drifts had piled up against the cabin walls, some as high as his waist. The sky was clearing, pale blue showing through gaps in the clouds. It would take time to dig out, but the worst had passed. He turned back to find Sarah awake and watching him. "The storm is over," he said. She nodded slowly. "What happens now?" It was a good question, and Jacob did not have a simple answer. What he wanted to say was that he would take care of her and her son, that he would make sure they never wanted for anything, that he would be there for every moment they needed him. But they had known each other for less than 24 hours. He had no right to make promises like that, no matter what he felt stirring in his heart. "Now I dig us out," he said instead. "And when the way is clear enough, I will take you to town. The doctor should check you and the baby, make sure everything is all right." "I cannot afford a doctor," Sarah said quietly, her eyes sliding away from his. "I have almost nothing left. The Saudi is mortgaged and I have maybe $20 to my name. I was planning to try to find work in town after the baby came, maybe cleaning or taking in laundry, something I could do while caring for an infant. I know it will be hard, but I can manage. I have been managing. Jacob crossed the room and knelt beside the cot so he was at her eye level. You do not have to manage alone anymore, he said, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. I know we just met, I know this is sudden, but Sarah, what happened last night changed something for me. I cannot explain it any better than that. Let me help you. Let me be there for you and your son. Sarah's eyes widened and fresh tears welled up in them. Jacob, you do not owe us anything. You already saved our lives. You do not have to. This is not about owing, Jacob interrupted gently. This is about wanting. I want to help. I want to know that you are both safe and cared for. I have been drifting for a long time, Sarah, never staying anywhere, never letting myself care too much about anything. But last night, keeping that fire burning and helping your son come into this world, I felt like I had a purpose. Like I mattered. I do not want to go back to drifting, not if there is a chance for something more. He reached out and carefully touched the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately wrapped around his pinky, the grip surprisingly strong. Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. Let me court you properly, he said, looking back up at Sarah. Let me prove that I am serious about this. You do not have to give me an answer right now, just think about it. Sarah was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. I do not need to think about it, she said, her voice shaking. Last night I thought I was going to die. I thought my baby was going to die. I was so frightened and so alone, and then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I did not even have time to say. You were strong and calm and kind, and you never once made me feel like I was a burden. You kept the fire burning all night, Jacob. You kept us warm and safe. How could I not want you in our lives? Jacob felt something break open inside his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it was there. Hope. Joy. The possibility of a future that held more than just the next ranch, the next job, the next lonely night. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to Sarah's forehead, gentle and chaste and full of promise. Then we will figure this out together, he said, all three of us. It took Jacob most of the morning to dig a path from the cabin to where he had left his horse in the lean-to shelter. The animal was fine, having weathered the storm with the stoic patience horses seemed to possess. He saddled up and rode slowly back toward the main ranch to let them know he was all right and to borrow a wagon. The foreman, a grizzled man named Tom Carter who had been working cattle since before Jacob was born, took one look at his face and asked what had happened. Jacob told the story as simply as he could, leaving out the parts about his feelings, focusing on the facts. A woman caught in the storm, a baby born early, both mother and child surviving the night. Tom listened without interrupting, and when Jacob finished, the older man nodded slowly. You did good, son, he said, and the approval in his voice meant more than Jacob wanted to admit. Take the wagon. Take whatever supplies you think they might need. The boss will not mind, and if he does, I will deal with it. Jacob loaded the wagon with blankets, food, and a basket of things he thought a new mother might need. One of the ranch hands had a wife who had recently given birth, and the man donated a bundle of baby clothes his own son had outgrown. By the time Jacob drove the wagon back to the line shack, it was afternoon, and the sun was shining brilliantly on the snow-covered landscape. The world looked clean and new, like it had been scrubbed fresh by the storm. Sarah was sitting up when he came in, the baby cradled in her arms, and the smile she gave him made the long, cold ride worthwhile. I thought maybe I had dreamed you, she said, that I would wake up and you would be gone and I would still be in the snow. I am real, Jacob assured her. And I brought supplies. Are you strong enough to travel? The wagon is not exactly comfortable, but I can pile it with blankets and drive slow. We should get you and the baby to town, let the doctor have a look. Sarah nodded. I feel better than I have any right to. Tired and sore, but better. This little one is a fighter. She looked down at her son with such tenderness that Jacob had to look away, feeling like he was intruding on something sacred. The trip to town took 3 hours, the wagon moving carefully over snow-packed roads. Jacob had made a nest of blankets in the back for Sarah to lie in with the baby, and he checked on them frequently to make sure they were warm enough. The sun was beginning to set by the time they rolled into Silver Creek, the small town that served the ranches and homesteads scattered across this part of Wyoming. The doctor, an older man named Samuel Price, examined both Sarah and the baby and declared them remarkably healthy given the circumstances. "That boy is small, but he has got good lungs and a strong suck," Dr. Price said, washing his hands in the basin. "Keep him warm, keep him fed, and he should do fine. As for you, Mrs. Mitchell, you are one of the luckiest women I have ever met. Giving birth in a blizzard in a line shack with only a cowboy for help, you should be in much worse shape. Someone was watching over you." "Someone was," Sarah agreed, her eyes finding Jacob's across the room. "His name is Jacob Hayes." Dr. Price looked between them and something knowing flickered across his weathered face. "Well then, Mr. Hayes, you have my admiration. Not many men could have kept their heads in that situation." He reached into a cabinet and pulled out a small bottle. "This is for the pain, Mrs. Mitchell, just a few drops in water when you need it. Do not overdo it, especially if you are nursing." Jacob paid the doctor before Sarah could protest, using money from his own savings that he kept in a pouch on his belt. It was not much, most of his pay going toward a piece of land he had been thinking about buying up north, but he did not care. Sarah and the baby needed care more than he needed that land. When they left the doctor's office, Sarah touched his arm. "You have to let me pay you back," she said. "For the doctor, for everything, I do not want to be a charity case." "You are not a charity case," Jacob said firmly. "You are a woman who had some bad luck and who deserves help. When you are back on your feet, if you still want to pay me back, we can talk about it then. But right now, I want you to focus on healing and taking care of your son." He paused. "Have you thought about what you are going to name him?" Sarah looked down at the baby bundled against her chest. "I was going to name him after my husband if he was a boy," she said slowly. "But after last night, I keep thinking about fire, how you kept it burning no matter what, how it saved our lives." She looked up at Jacob. "What do you think about ash, Ash Mitchell? It means fire in a way, the fire that burns and the fire that remains." "Ash," Jacob repeated, testing the name. "I like it. It is strong, fitting for a boy who fought to be born in the middle of a blizzard." Sarah smiled. "Ash it is, then." They stayed in town that night at the boarding house, Jacob paying for a room for Sarah and taking a spot in the bunkhouse for himself. He brought her dinner from the restaurant and made sure she had everything she needed before he left for the night. As he lay on the narrow bunk surrounded by snoring ranch hands passing through town, Jacob stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 36 hours. His life had been simple before the storm. He worked, he slept, he moved from place to place without attachments. Now he found himself thinking about a woman with honey-colored eyes and a baby named Ash and what it might mean to build something permanent. The next morning, he went to the boarding house early to check on Sarah. She was awake and nursing Ash when he arrived, and the landlady, a motherly woman named Mrs. Chen, was sitting with her offering advice and admiration in equal measure. "Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Chen said when she saw him, "Mrs. Mitchell has been telling me about your heroics. The whole town is going to be talking about this for months." Jacob felt his face heat with embarrassment. "I just did what needed to be done." "You did more than that, and you know it," Sarah said softly. She looked better this morning, some color back in her cheeks, though she still moved carefully. "Jacob, I have been thinking about what you said yesterday, about courting me properly. I want you to know that I am serious about giving you that chance, but I also need to be practical. I cannot stay here at the boarding house indefinitely. I cannot afford it. And I cannot go back to the Saudi, not in winter with a newborn baby and no way to properly heat it." Jacob had been thinking about this very problem all night. "I have an idea," he said. "The Double R Ranch where I work, they have a few cabins on the property that they use for married hands. One of them is empty right now. I could talk to the foreman, see if you could stay there for the winter. You would be warm and safe, and I could check on you every day. In the spring, we can figure out something more permanent. Why would they do that for me? Sarah asked, confusion creasing her brow. They do not even know me. They know me, Jacob said. And Tom Carter, the foreman, he is a good man. He understands hard luck. Besides, ranches always need help. Maybe you could take over some of the cooking for the hands in exchange for the cabin. Mrs. Brennan, who usually does it, has been complaining that it is getting to be too much for her. You would have to bring Ash with you, but I think it could work. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but then Ash made a small sound and her face softened. If you can arrange it, she said quietly, I would be grateful, more grateful than I can say. Tom Carter agreed to the arrangement more easily than Jacob had dared hope. The foreman took one look at Sarah and baby Ash and his gruff expression melted. My wife and I lost a baby years ago, he said, his voice rough with old grief. Born too early, just like your boy, did not make it through the first night. You are a fighter, Mrs. Mitchell, and so is your son. You can have the cabin for as long as you need it. So Sarah moved into a small but sturdy cabin on the Double R Ranch, and Jacob helped her settle in. The cabin had a good stove, a proper bed, a rocking chair by the window, and enough space for everything she and Ash needed. Jacob brought firewood every day without fail, always making sure she had more than enough to keep the cabin warm. He brought food from the main house, stopped by to check if she needed anything, and spent his evenings sitting with her after his work was done, talking about everything and nothing while Ash slept in a cradle one of the ranch hands had built. Those winter weeks were the happiest Jacob could remember. He loved the routine of it, the simple domesticity of coming to Sarah's cabin after a long day of work and finding her waiting with a smile. He loved watching Ash grow, the baby putting on weight and becoming more alert with each passing day. He loved the way Sarah laughed at his stories, and the way she listened when he talked about his dreams of owning his own place someday. He loved the way she looked at him like he was someone special, someone worth caring about. They courted properly, the way Jacob had promised. He never pressured her for more than she was willing to give, content to earn her trust day by day. They went on walks when the weather permitted, Sarah bundled up with Ash strapped against her chest. They sat together in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing comfortable silence. Jacob brought her small gifts when he went into town, nothing extravagant because he did not have much money, but things he thought she might need or enjoy. A book of poetry, a pretty ribbon for her hair, a wooden rattle for Ash carved by one of the older ranch hands. Sarah reciprocated in her own ways. She cooked meals for him, wonderful hearty food that filled his belly and made him feel cared for in a way he had not experienced since his mother died years ago. She mended his torn shirts and sewed buttons back on his coat. She asked about his day and actually listened to the answers. She let him hold Ash, teaching him how to support the baby's head, how to calm him when he fussed. And slowly, gradually, she let him into her heart. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late February, with the snow finally beginning to melt and the first hints of spring in the air, that things changed between them. Jacob had come to take Sarah and Ash on a walk to see the new calves that had been born the week before. Ash was awake and alert, his blue eyes beginning to shift to what would eventually be brown, his baby smile appearing whenever anyone talked to him. Sarah looked beautiful in a simple blue dress, her dark hair pulled back from her face, her cheeks pink from the cool air. They stood at the fence watching the calves kick and play, and Jacob pointed out which cow was which, telling stories about their personalities and quirks. Sarah laughed at his descriptions, and then she turned to him with an expression that made his breath catch. "Jacob," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." His heart started pounding. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes. "I think I started falling that night in the blizzard when you looked at me and promised we would get through it together. But I did not want to say anything too soon. I did not want to mistake gratitude for something deeper, but it has been 2 months now and what I feel has only grown stronger. You are kind and hardworking and so good with Ash. You make me feel safe." You make me feel like maybe the future does not have to be something I face alone." She took a shaky breath. "I know my life is complicated. I know I come with a baby and debts and more baggage than any man should have to take on. But if you still want me, Jacob Hayes, I am yours." Jacob felt like his heart might burst right out of his chest. He reached out and cupped Sarah's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have been in love with you since the moment you trusted me to help bring your son into this world. You are brave and strong and beautiful, and Ash is not baggage. He is a blessing. I want nothing more than to build a life with both of you, if you will let me." He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise, while baby Ash cooed between them and the spring wind whispered through the grass. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was smiling through her tears, and Jacob felt more certain about his future than he ever had about anything in his life. They were married in Silver Creek on a sunny day in April 1885, with Tom Carter standing up as Jacob's best man and Mrs. Chen from the boarding house serving as Sarah's matron of honor. Ash, now 4 months old and thriving, dozed through the ceremony in a basket at their feet. The whole town seemed to turn out for the wedding, everyone wanting to see the couple whose romance had been born in such dramatic circumstances. The story of the blizzard and the birth and the cowboy who kept the fire burning had taken on a life of its own, growing more dramatic with each retelling, but Jacob did not mind. The important thing was that Sarah was now his wife, and he was her husband, and they were a family. Jacob used his savings to buy a piece of land bordering the Double R Ranch, 160 acres with good water and decent grazing. It was not much, but it was theirs. He built a house with his own hands, working every spare moment he had while continuing his job at the ranch. Other hands helped when they could, and Tom Carter donated lumber left over from a barn raising. The house was small but solid, with a big stone fireplace and windows that let in plenty of light. Jacob made sure it had everything Sarah and Ash needed, including a room that could serve as a nursery. They moved into the new house in June, and Sarah stood in the middle of the main room with Ash on her hip and tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Jacob, it is absolutely perfect. It is ours," Jacob said, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Our home, our future." That first year of marriage was hard work but deeply satisfying. Jacob started building his own small herd, buying cattle when he could afford it and carefully managing the land. Sarah took care of the house and Ash and helped with the lighter ranch work. She planted a garden that flourished under her care, providing vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. Ash grew from a baby into a toddler, taking his first steps and saying his first words, bringing joy to their lives every single day. In the evenings, Jacob always made sure there was a fire in the fireplace, even when the weather was warm and they did not really need it. It became a ritual, a reminder of the night that had brought them together. Sarah would sit in the rocking chair with her sewing or knitting, and Jacob would stretch out on the floor playing with Ash, and the fire would crackle and pop, filling the room with warmth and light. Sometimes Sarah would look at him with such love in her eyes that Jacob had to look away, overwhelmed by the depth of what he felt. He had never imagined he could be this happy, this content. He had thought he was meant to drift, to never put down roots, but Sarah and Ash had changed everything. They had given him a reason to stay, to build, to believe in something beyond just the next day. 2 years after they married, Sarah told him she was pregnant again. Jacob felt his heart skip with excitement and fear in equal measure, remembering too clearly the terror of Ash's birth. But this pregnancy was different. Sarah had proper medical care, regular checkups with Dr. Price, plenty of food and warmth and rest. When her time came in the autumn of 1887, Jacob took her to town and the doctor was there to help. The birth was still difficult, still frightening in its own way, but it was nothing like that desperate night in the blizzard. They had a daughter this time, a tiny red-faced girl with a powerful set of lungs and her mother's honey-colored eyes. Sarah wanted to name her Rose, and Jacob agreed immediately. Rose Hayes came into the world surrounded by safety and warmth, so different from her brother's dramatic entrance, but loved no less fiercely. Ash, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He wanted to hold her constantly, to show her his toys, to tell her long, rambling stories that made no sense but which he delivered with great seriousness. Jacob watched his son with his daughter and felt his heart swell with a pride and love so intense it was almost painful. This was his family. These were his people, and he would keep them safe and warm and loved for the rest of his days. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Jacob was careful with money, never taking unnecessary risks, always planning for the future. He hired a hand to help with the work, a young man named Billy who reminded Jacob of himself a few years earlier, drifting and looking for purpose. Jacob paid him fair wages and treated him with respect, and Billy repaid him with loyalty and hard work. Sarah expanded her garden and started raising chickens, selling eggs in town and using the profits to buy things the family needed. She was smart with money, able to stretch a dollar further than seemed possible, and Jacob learned to trust her judgment on financial matters. They made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses, working together toward shared goals. Life was not always easy. There were years when the weather did not cooperate, when cattle died or prices dropped. There were illnesses and injuries, worries and setbacks. But through it all, they had each other. On the hardest days, when Jacob felt overwhelmed by responsibility and uncertainty, he would come home to find Sarah waiting with understanding in her eyes and love in her smile. And he would remember that night in the blizzard when she had trusted him completely, when he had promised they would get through it together, and he would know they could face anything as long as they stood together. Ash grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and wanted to be a cowboy just like his father. Jacob taught him to ride, to rope, to understand the land and the animals. He told him stories about the old days, though he never embellished or romanticized the hardships. He wanted his son to understand that the life they had was built on hard work and sacrifice and love. Rose grew into a sweet but stubborn little girl who had her mother wrapped around her finger and her father not far behind. She loved helping Sarah in the garden and learning to cook and following Ash around even when he protested that she was too little. On winter evenings, the family would gather around the fireplace, and Jacob would tell stories while Sarah knitted and the children played. Sometimes Ash would ask about the night he was born, and Jacob would tell the story, watching Sarah's face as he recounted how brave she had been, how strong. "Your mama walked through a blizzard to try to save you," he would tell his son, "and I kept the fire burning all night to keep you both warm. You came into this world fighting, Ash, and you have been fighting ever since. Tell the part about how you fell in love," Rose would demand. Even though she had heard the story 100 times, Jacob would smile and take Sarah's hand. "I fell in love with your mother the moment I saw her courage," he would say. "And I stayed in love with her every day after because she is the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known." Sarah would blush and tell him he was being ridiculous, but her eyes would shine with happiness, and later when the children were asleep, she would kiss him and tell him she loved him, and Jacob would feel like the luckiest man alive. Years passed in a blur of seasons and work and family moments. Jacob's small ranch grew into a successful operation. He was able to buy more land, expand his herd, build a proper barn and outbuildings. He was respected in the community, known as a fair employer and an honest businessman. But more than any of that, he was known as a devoted husband and father, a man who loved his family with his whole heart. In the spring of 1892, Sarah told him she was pregnant again. They were older now, Jacob approaching 40 and Sarah not far behind, and this pregnancy was harder on her body than the previous two had been. Jacob worried constantly, remembering too vividly what could go wrong. But Sarah was determined and stubborn, and she refused to let fear control her life. "We will get through this together," she told him, echoing the words he had said to her so many years ago in the blizzard. "Just like we always do." Their second son was born in September, a healthy baby with a surprisingly calm temperament. They named him Thomas, after Tom Carter, who had been such a good friend to them over the years. The old foreman cried when they told him, not even trying to hide his tears. Ash, now 8 years old, declared he would teach his little brother everything important. Rose, at 5, appointed herself the baby's primary caretaker and refused to let anyone hold Thomas without her supervision. Jacob looked at his family, at Sarah holding their newborn son while their 2 older children crowded close to see, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. 9 years ago, he had been a drifting cowboy with no real ties to anyone or anything. Now he had a wife he loved more than life, 3 beautiful children, land of his own, and a future that stretched bright and promising ahead. All because of one terrible blizzard and one terrifying night when he had promised a frightened woman that they would get through it together. That evening, after the children were finally asleep, and Sarah was resting with baby Thomas beside her, Jacob built up the fire in their bedroom fireplace. He sat in the chair next to the bed and watched the flames dance, thinking about that night in the lined shack. He had been so scared, so certain he would fail, but somehow they had made it through. He had kept the fire burning, and Sarah had been strong, and Ash had fought to be born, and everything had worked out against all odds. Sarah reached out and took his hand, pulling him from his thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "That night," Jacob said. "The blizzard. How different my life would be if I had not heard you scream through the wind." Sarah squeezed his fingers. "You saved us. You gave us everything, Jacob, a home, a family, a life better than I ever dreamed possible." "No," Jacob said, shaking his head. "We built this together. You worked just as hard as I did. You were just as brave. We saved each other, Sarah. That is the truth of it." She smiled at him, that same smile that had caught his heart 9 years ago and never let go. "Then I guess we are both lucky." "The luckiest," Jacob agreed. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "I love you, Sarah Hayes. I will love you until the day I die and beyond if there is anything after." "I love you too," Sarah whispered, "my cowboy who keeps the fire burning." They sat together in the firelight, hand in hand, while their children slept safe and warm around them. Outside, the Wyoming night was quiet and peaceful, so different from that terrible blizzard so many years ago. But Jacob would never forget that night. It was the night that changed everything, the night he found his purpose, the night he learned what it meant to love and be loved in return. It was the night Ash was born, tiny and early and fighting for every breath. And it was the night Jacob kept the fire burning through the darkness, never letting the flames die, because he had promised a frightened woman they would get through it together. And they had. Against all odds and despite every obstacle, they had not just survived but thrived. They had built a life, raised a family, created something permanent and beautiful out of that one desperate night. The fire he had tended so carefully in that lined shack had become the foundation of everything they were. It had kept them warm when they needed it most, and its light had guided them toward each other. Jacob looked at his sleeping wife, at the baby nestled beside her, at the door behind which his other 2 children dreamed, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would keep the fire burning for them always. Not just the physical fire in the hearth, but the fire of love and commitment and family. He would feed it and tend it and never let it die, because that was what you did for the people you loved. You kept the fire burning no matter what storms came. You kept the light alive in the darkness. You held on and you fought and you promised that together you would make it through. And that was exactly what they did for all the years that followed. Through hard times and good, through laughter and tears, through everything life threw at them, Jacob and Sarah stood together. The cowboy who had kept the fire burning and the woman whose baby was born early in the middle of winter became legends in their own small way, their love story told and retold around firesides throughout Wyoming. But to Jacob and Sarah, they were not legends. They were just two people who had found each other in the midst of a storm and had chosen to build a life together, one day at a time, one fire at a time, one moment of love at a time. Their children grew up strong and healthy, carrying forward the values their parents had taught them about hard work and kindness and the importance of family. Ash became a rancher like his father, eventually taking over the operation and expanding it further. Rose married a good man from town and had children of her own, bringing them to visit their grandparents every Sunday. Thomas, the baby born 9 years after his brother, became a veterinarian, using his skills to help the animals and people of their community. Jacob and Sarah grew old together, their hands becoming weathered and their hair turning gray, but their love never diminishing. They sat together on the porch of the house Jacob had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had played years before. And every night, without fail, Jacob would build a fire in the hearth, keeping the flames burning bright and warm, a promise kept and a love remembered. When they were both in their 70s, sitting together on a winter evening with the fire crackling and snow falling softly outside, Sarah looked at Jacob and said, "Do you remember that night, the blizzard?" "Every detail," Jacob said. "How could I forget the night that gave me everything?" "I was so scared," Sarah admitted. "I thought we were both going to die. But then I saw your face and you were scared too, but you did not let it stop you. You just kept moving, kept doing what needed to be done. You kept the fire burning, Jacob. All night long, you never let it go out." "I could not," Jacob said simply. "You needed me. Ash needed me. Letting that fire die was not an option." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder. "You have been keeping the fire burning for us ever since. For more than 30 years now. Do you ever get tired of it?" Jacob kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Never," he said. "Not once. Keeping the fire burning for you and our family is the greatest honor of my life. I would do it forever if I could." "You already have," Sarah whispered, "in all the ways that matter." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance and listening to the wind outside. It was not a blizzard, just a gentle winter storm, beautiful and peaceful. But it reminded them both of that other storm so many years ago, the one that had brought them together against all odds. The one that had started everything. Jacob Hayes had been a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name but a horse and his skills. Sarah Mitchell had been a desperate widow trying to survive with a baby on the way. But together, on one freezing night in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, they had found something neither of them had known they were looking for. They had found love and partnership and family. They had found home. And it all started because a cowboy heard a woman scream through the wind, because he chose to help instead of seeking shelter alone, because he made a promise in the darkness that they would get through the night together. It all started because her baby was born early in the middle of winter, and the cowboy kept the fire burning through the night, never giving up, never surrendering to fear or exhaustion or doubt. He kept the flames alive, and in doing so, he kept them alive. He gave them warmth when they needed it most, and that warmth became the foundation of everything that followed. Years later, when Jacob Hayes died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78 with Sarah beside him, his children and grandchildren gathered to remember him. They told stories about his hard work and his integrity, his kindness and his strength. But the story they told most often was the one about the blizzard and the birth and the fire that burned all night long. They told it because it was true and because it mattered, because it showed who Jacob Hayes had been at his core. A man who kept his promises. A man who did not give up when things got hard. A man who loved his family with everything he had. A man who kept the fire burning no matter what. Sarah lived for 3 more years after Jacob died, cared for by her children who had learned from their parents what it meant to be devoted to family. She spent her final years surrounded by love, telling her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about the cowboy who had saved her life and stolen her heart. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, her family buried her next to Jacob under a cottonwood tree on the land they had built together. And on the headstone, they had carved simple words that said everything that needed to be said. Together they weathered every storm. Together they kept the fire burning. Together they loved. And in the little town of Silver Creek and throughout the ranching community of Wyoming for generations after, people told the story of Sarah and Jacob. The woman whose baby was born early in the middle of winter and the cowboy who kept the fire burning through the night. The love that began in a blizzard and lasted a lifetime. The family built on promises kept and fires tended and two hearts that beat as one. It was a story of survival and courage, of love found in the darkest hour, of commitment that never wavered. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep the fire burning, whatever that fire might be. Keep it burning for the people you love, for the future you are building, for the promises you have made. Keep it burning even when you are tired, even when you are scared, even when giving up seems easier. Keep it burning because that fire is life and hope and love, and as long as it burns, anything is possible. The Hayes family continued to grow and thrive, generation after generation, always remembering the story of how it all began. And on winter nights when snow fell and wind howled, they would gather around their fires and tell the old story once more, keeping alive the memory of Sarah and Jacob, of a baby born too early and a cowboy who refused to let them die. They would remember, and in remembering they would understand what it meant to be a Hayes, to be strong, to be loving, to be the kind of person who keeps the fire burning no matter what. And somewhere in the stars, if such things are possible, Sarah and Jacob were together still, watching over the family they had created, their love story eternal, their fire burning forever bright.